The diner was the kind of place that hadn't changed in 50 years. Checkered floors worn smooth by time, faded photos on the walls, and a neon sign out front that buzzed softly like an old radio stuck between stations. It sat on the edge of town, the last stop before the long stretch of desert highway that ran straight into nowhere. Inside, John Grizz Reynolds sat at his usual booth near the window, his hands wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee. His jacket was old, military issued, the kind that had been through wars and still held together. His weathered face was unreadable, the deep lines around his eyes a map of every battlefield he had walked away from. He didn't come here for conversation. He came here for quiet. But quiet wasn't going to last tonight. The first sign of trouble came with the low, guttural rumble of motorcycles rolling into the parking lot. The sound vibrated through the glass, shaking the cheap metal napkin dispensers on the tables. Rachel, the young waitress who had been refilling a coffee cup at the counter, froze. Joe, the diner owner, muttered a curse under his breath and wiped his hands on a dish towel. Grizz didn't turn around. He knew exactly who had just walked in. Hello, Mr. Pictures here, and before we continue with the story, please subscribe to the channel, as it would allow me to continue with these stories. Thank you. Now, back to the story. The door swung open with too much force, hitting the wall with a dull thud. A group of bikers strode inside, their boots clunking heavily against the tile. 6 of them, maybe 7. Leather jackets, chains, the usual posturing of men who thought the world owed them something. Their leader, a wiry, snake-eyed bastard named Roach, grinned as he scanned the diner, looking for someone to intimidate. The moment his eyes landed on Grizz, his smirk widened. "Check this out," Roach said, nudging one of his crew. Old-timer over here, still wearing his army rags. Grizz took a slow sip of coffee. Didn't react. The bikers laughed, but it wasn't real laughter. It was forced, the kind men used when they needed to prove something to their own crew. Roach stepped closer, tapping the table with his knuckles. "Hey, Grandpa, you hear me? Or is that fancy military training not worth shit anymore?" Rachel swallowed hard. She glanced toward Joe, uncertain. Joe sighed. "Roach, maybe you oughta..." Roach didn't even look at him. "Shut up, Joe." The diner fell silent. The other bikers started closing in, leaning on tables, kicking out chairs as if the place belonged to them. One of them, a thick-necked idiot with a skull tattoo on his hand, grabbed Rachel by the wrist when she tried to back away. She flinched. "Let go." Grizz finally looked up. His eyes were calm, steady, like a man looking at a piece of paper, reading the situation like an old map. He didn't get angry, didn't speak, just stared. And suddenly, the room felt colder. Rachel wrenched her arm free, backing toward the counter. Roach smirked. "What's the matter, old man? Ain't got anything to say?" Still, Grizz didn't react. He just reached into his jacket, pulled out an old flip phone, and dialed a number. The bikers laughed. "Oh no, Grandpa's calling the cops," one of them sneered. Grizz put the phone to his ear, spoke just 6 words. "It's Grizz. I need a favor." Then he closed the phone and set it on the table, and went back to drinking his coffee. The laughter stopped. The bikers looked at each other. Roach's grin faltered just slightly. "The hell was that?" Grizz didn't answer. Joe cleared his throat. Roach, maybe you should..." The first headlights appeared through the window. Roach's eyes flicked toward them. Then came the engines. Not just one, not 2, a dozen, maybe more. The deep rolling thunder of big trucks, motorcycles, vehicles too heavy, too loud, too damn many. Rachel took a step back, whispering, "What the hell is happening?" Outside, the parking lot filled up. First came the motorcycles, gleaming chrome, engines rumbling like a low growl from something dangerous. But behind them, the trucks, big ones, black SUVs, unmarked but unmistakable. Military grade, built for war. The door swung open again, but this time, it wasn't bikers walking in. The first man who stepped through was built like a tank, broad shoulders and a scar running from his jawline to his ear. His leather vest bore a patch, Special Forces. Another followed, tall, calm, with an old Marine Corps tattoo on his forearm. Then another, and another. Men who had seen war, men who had survived it. And now they were here, for Grizz. The tension crushed the air from the room. Roach's crew stiffened, their bravado wilting under the weight of what was happening. The man with the scar nodded toward Grizz. "Which ones?" Grizz finally set his coffee down. He gestured lazily toward Roach and his men. These boys thought they could play tough. Roach took half a step back. His throat worked like he wanted to swallow, but he couldn't quite manage it. This ain't necessary," he stammered. The biggest man in the group chuckled, a low, humorless sound. "Oh, I think it is." The veterans moved in. The bikers didn't even try to fight. Roach stumbled over his own feet, his hands raised, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. "We were just messing around," one of the others blurted. Holloway, the ex-Marine, tilted his head, then apologized. The biker hesitated. Holloway took one step closer. The biker flinched. "Sorry." Roach licked his lips, his face pale. Yeah, we didn't mean anything by it." Grizz picked up his coffee again. "That wasn't so hard, was it?" Holloway smirked. "Now get the hell out of here." The bikers didn't argue. They scrambled for the door, nearly tripping over each other. The roar of their own engines screamed into the night as they tore out of the parking lot, running like beaten dogs. Inside, the diner exhaled. Rachel stared at Grizz, her hands shaking. Who the hell did you just call?" Grizz smirked, flipping open his phone again. "Just some old friends." The sound of roaring engines faded into the night, but the weight of what had just happened still hung thick in the air. The bikers had run, faces pale, voices tight with weak apologies, but John "Grizz" Reynolds hadn't even lifted a finger, not physically at least. His phone still rested on the table, closed, silent. A small, unassuming relic from an era before smartphones and social media. And yet, it had summoned ghosts of war into that diner like a damn battle cry. Rachel stood behind the counter, her knuckles white where she gripped a coffee pot, her eyes darting from Grizz to the men now standing in the diner. They weren't just any men, they were veterans. Holloway, the scarred ex-Marine who had led them inside, watched the door for a long moment, like he was making sure none of those cowards got any ideas about turning back. His leather vest bore a faded Special Forces insignia, the kind of mark a man didn't wear unless he had earned it in blood. Behind him, the others stood with the quiet authority of men who had walked through hell and lived to talk about it. Some of them had old military patches sewn onto their jackets. Others had the look of men who had traded their service rifles for Harleys and highways. But one thing was certain. They weren't here to make friends. Holloway finally turned to Grizz. His eyes flicked over the old soldier, scanning him the way men like them always did, looking for wounds, for changes, for things unsaid. "You good?" he asked. His voice was low, gruff. Grizz lifted his coffee, took a slow sip, and nodded. "Yeah." Joe, the diner owner, exhaled sharply from behind the counter, wiping his sweaty hands on a rag. "Jesus Christ, Grizz," he muttered. "Could have warned me before you brought the damn cavalry down on my place." Grizz smirked. "Figured you'd appreciate the show." Joe scoffed, but his face was still tight. His jaw clenched like he wasn't quite sure if he should be relieved or terrified. Rachel hadn't moved. She was still staring at Holloway and his men, her breath shallow. Who are they?" she finally asked. Holloway's lips twitched slightly at the corners, but the smile never quite reached his eyes. "Just some old friends of Grizz." Rachel swallowed. Old friends don't just show up in a damn army. Grizz set his coffee down, finally looking at her. His expression was calm, but something dark lurked behind his eyes. Something old, something sharp. "These aren't regular bikers, kid," he said, voice quiet. "These are wolves." Rachel frowned. "Wolves?" Grizz gestured at the men standing around the diner. "Every one of them is a veteran, Special Forces, Rangers, Marines. We serve together. And when a man like me makes a call, they answer." Rachel's gaze snapped back to Holloway, as if seeing him for the first time. "You mean they just drop everything and show up?" Holloway shrugged. "That's what brotherhood means." Rachel's face was pale. "For what? To fight?" Grizz's fingers drummed once against the table. "No," he said simply, "to end it." The weight of those words settled over the room like a heavy fog. Joe muttered a curse under his breath. Duke, the mechanic who had been sitting nearby, finally spoke. "They're not done, are they?" Grizz shook his head. "No." Rachel's breath hitched slightly. Holloway cracked his knuckles. "Then let's make sure they don't get a second chance." Joe slammed his rag down on the counter. Oh, come on! This is a diner, not a war zone. Grizz stood, rolling out the tension in his shoulders. Not yet. Rachel's voice was barely above a whisper. And if they come back? Grizz's smirk was cold, a wolf's grin beneath tired eyes. Then we remind them why men like us don't scare easy. Outside, the neon sign flickered, the desert wind howled, and the real wolves waited. The stillness in the diner was the kind that only came before violence. It wasn't fear, not for the men standing inside, but something heavier, something inevitable. The kind of silence soldiers knew too well, the pause before a fight that wasn't going to end with just words. John Grizz Reynolds stood by his booth, his coffee still warm, but untouched now. He didn't need it. He had already woken up. Outside, the desert stretched wide and dark, the glow of the diner's flickering neon sign the only thing cutting through the night. But beyond that light, something was moving. Rachel stood by the counter, her hands gripping the edge so tight her knuckles were turning white. "I don't see them," she whispered, staring out the window. Grizz didn't look. He didn't need to. "They're watching," he murmured. Rachel's breath hitched slightly. "How do you know?" Grizz finally turned his head, his eyes sharp, steady. "Because that's what I'd do." Duke shifted beside him, rolling his shoulders. "So, what's the play, old man?" Grizz took a slow breath, feeling the weight of the moment settle on his bones. "We make them think they're in control," Duke scoffed. "And when they take the bait?" Grizz's smirk was almost wolfish. "Then we remind them why we're still standing." Holloway, the ex-Marine, stepped up beside them, his face carved from stone. "They brought more this time." His voice was calm even. "I count at least 15 out there, more waiting up the road." Rachel paled. 15? You're saying there's more of them than before?" Holloway nodded. "That's how men like them work. They don't fight fair." Grizz let out a small chuckle. "Good, neither do we." Outside, the first engine rumbled, then another. A line of motorcycles rolled in slowly, their headlights off, creeping toward the diner like shadows slithering through the dark. The black truck from earlier was back too, parking at an angle, blocking part of the lot like they were staking their claim. The door to the truck opened and Brick stepped out first. Even from across the lot, the neon glow caught the hard lines of his face, the cold focus in his eyes. He wasn't posturing like the others. He wasn't here to play games. Then Snake emerged beside him, his lips still swollen, his pride still bleeding from the last encounter. But now he had his numbers. Now he had backup. And now he thought he was in control. "That's a whole lot of noise for some cowards running away last time," Duke muttered. Grizz exhaled slowly, then picked up his coffee cup one last time, finishing it in a single sip before setting it down with a quiet clink. "Let's go meet them." He stepped toward the door. Holloway and Duke followed, their boots heavy against the tile. The other veterans stood, moving with calm, deliberate ease, men who had walked into worse situations and walked out again. Rachel swallowed hard. "You're really just walking out there?" Grizz glanced back at her, his voice low but steady. "You don't wait for the wolves to come inside, kid. You go out and face them." Then he pushed open the door, stepping into the night. The desert air was cold, the smell of oil and gasoline thick. The bikers stood in a loose semicircle, their posture casual, but their hands never far from their belts. Grizz kept walking. He stopped just short of them, his hands in his pockets, looking at Snake like a teacher looking at a student who hadn't learned his lesson yet. Snake sneered. "You got a death wish, old man." Grizz tilted his head slightly. "I don't die easy." Snake spat onto the pavement, his shoulders coiling like a snake about to strike. "You think your little retirement club in there is gonna stop us? You think—" Grizz held up a hand, cutting him off. The move was slow, calm, not threatening, but it made everyone freeze. Snake blinked, thrown off for a second. "What?" Then they heard it, a single rumble in the distance. Then another. Engines, but not theirs. Snake's men turned toward the highway, eyes narrowing. More headlights appeared on the horizon. Then more. They weren't loud, not yet. But they were coming. Snake's cocky smirk wavered. "The hell is that?" Grizz's voice was low, unshaken, absolute. "My backup." The first motorcycles rolled into view, their engines humming low. Then came the trucks, dark, unmarked, military grade, the kind that didn't belong in small-town parking lots. One by one, they pulled in, lining up behind Grizz and his men, their engines cutting off all at once. Then the doors opened. Men stepped out, older, harder, faces carved from years of war and survival. Some wore biker vests with patches that told stories. Others wore plain jackets, their scars speaking louder than words. Holloway smirked. Told you, he never fights alone. Brick's face was the first to change. His jaw tightened, his fingers flexing. He understood. He had seen real soldiers before. Snake, though, was still trying to hold on. You really think? Grizz cut him off again. You're outnumbered, he said simply. You're outmatched, and you've already lost. Snake's face twisted with rage. His hand twitches toward his belt. But before he can even think about pulling the knife, Holloway is already moving. In one swift motion, he has Snake by the wrist, twisting it back until the knife clatters to the pavement. Snake lets out a strangled grunt, his knees buckling. Brick steps forward, but Duke meets him halfway, his expression unreadable. Wanna test your odds? Brick hesitates. He's calculating. He knows how this ends. Snake, panting, glaring at Grizz from where Holloway has him pinned, spits. This ain't over. Grizz finally steps closer, his voice barely above a whisper. Yes, he says. It is. Holloway releases Snake, letting him stumble backward. Brick doesn't move to help him. Instead, Brick gives a single slow nod to Grizz, a look of understanding. Then he turns to Snake. Let's go. Snake looks like he's about to argue, but Brick's voice leaves no room for it. The bikers hesitate, then start backing away, climbing onto their bikes one by one. Within seconds, their engines roar back to life. They don't linger, they don't look back. They're gone. Silence returns. Grizz exhales, looking at Holloway. Appreciate the quick response. Holloway chuckles. Figured you'd have it handled before we got here. Grizz smirks. Never hurts to have backup. The other veterans exchange knowing looks, some shaking hands, some already heading back to their bikes. They had come for one reason, to remind the world that men like them weren't done yet. Rachel, still standing in the diner doorway, whispers, "What the hell just happened?" Joe shakes his head. Grizz happened. Grizz just picks up his coffee, still warm, and smirks. The end. Thank you for watching. Please leave a like and subscribe.